Time to start. So welcome everyone to today's roundtable discussion where we're focusing on the state of political leadership in Britain. My name is Toby James and I'm going to be chairing the session, and this is a workshop which is part of the POW series, the Politics on Wednesdays series. Yes, I know it's not Wednesday, it's Tuesday. But usually on Wednesday lunchtimes, if you don't come along already, we have open discussions where we focus on research or the current affairs of politics around the world. So please do come on to those sessions. So today marks the launch of two new books, just over there, the new second edition of the British Labour Leaders book and the British Conservative Leaders books, both out with Bite Back. The first edition of which was launched back in 2015. Then in the Speaker's residence, I think that's right, Charles, of the House of Commons, John Bercow's residences. So this year this time we've upgraded to Lecture Theatre 1 here at UEA, and that's not the only thing that's obviously changed since 2015. It's often said that sometimes history goes very, very slowly without too many events occurring. And then there are periods where history dramatically changes and things happen very, very quickly. So since the first edition of those books there, we've seen, for example, the rise of autocracy in many countries around the world, democracy being deconsolidated in the so-called established democracies, land war brought into Europe, technological transformations such as AI, the pandemic, cost of living crises, economic flatlining in many countries, including the United Kingdom, and political parties and their leaders being deeply unpopular in many countries, but including the UK as well. So the aim of today really then is considering the role of political leadership in this puzzle. Are these problems, for example, that have been created potentially by poor political leadership? Or is it the case that we've got political leaders that are trying to navigate through very, very difficult seas, doing their best, and we should give them much greater credit than potentially they already have? So we're delighted to have with us today Charles Clarke, or to have back to UEA, Charles Clarke. Charles was obviously former Home Secretary, Education Minister, but also Chairman of the Labour Party. He's held lots of academic posts, including here at the University of East Anglia. We have Tim Bale, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Patrick Diamond, Professor of Public Policy at Queen Mary University of London. And between us, we were at the editorial team for these volumes. And we're also delighted to have with us Emmanuelle, Avril, who's a Professor at the Université de la Sorbonne, Nouvelle. She is a leader herself. She's a member of the executive team for the Political Studies Association Research Group on political leadership. So the books try to set out some common language to help us to think about political leadership. I'm just going to introduce some of these ideas very, very quickly. And then we're going to move on to a very broad discussion where we'll look at the political leaders and their party fortunes so far, and try to assess this question about whether we have a political leadership crisis in the UK. So from the outset, the books try to make this really clear distinction between leadership by political cunning and leadership by political conscience. So leadership by cunning, political cunning, is thinking about whether leaders are successful in terms of whether they win office, whether they win power. Leadership by conscience is thinking about whether they achieve morally good outcomes that we can normatively say, well, they made a positive outcome on those areas. And to help us think about that, the first editions introduced this idea of statecraft, a concept that's been widely used in political science, but tries to bring this into some more public discussion. And statecraft was the art of winning elections, but also maintaining a sense of governing competence in office. To achieve good statecraft, you need to achieve a number of things. developing a winning electoral strategy, developing a reputation for governing competence, winning the battle of ideas over the day, whether that's on immigration policy or healthcare policy or the NHS or whatever else, being successful in terms of party management, and then more latterly thinking about constitutional management as well. The times have changed since the first edition. As I say, there is this spectre of autocracy, spectre of threats of democracy. And so the second editions try to bring in this idea that maybe we want to applaud good statecraft, but maybe only if it is in the context of democracy or democratic statecraft. And it also suggests that some other impacts that we might want to think about are the impacts of leaders in terms of societal structures. So what is their impact on the quality of democracy, on social cleavages that there are in society, on political institutions? So what are their impacts, for example, on Parliament? And then what are their impacts on particular policy areas? So what has been their impact on the economy, on inflation, on inequality, at the NHS, and so on and so forth. So that's my bit done in many senses. I'm going to hand over to our panelists in what follows for wide-ranging discussion, and then to you guys to ask questions, but also to give your sort of views as well in the final kind of section. So the first question really for the panel is to think about this question of, well, how should we assess political leaders? Is this statecraft framework helpful, or maybe this is actually part of the problem that we're applauding leaders for these things? Charles, I mean, obviously, I welcome do you want to kick us off in terms of your thoughts maybe about the statecraft framework, but also you've undertaken work that's in the book that then looks at assessing leaders in terms of their electoral fortunes. So, Charles.
The interview we held with Boris Johnson, he says his biggest failure was party management. He simply didn't believe that his Conservative MPs would be bothered about their loyalty to him, carry him through. A lot of speculation in the media at the moment about the and Keir Starmer. Toby's point about political argument hegemony, also a key point, and breaking the rules of the game. In America right at the moment, gerrymandering at the moment, trying to break the rules of the game. Trump's model. Now, I argue, and what my chapter in these books is about, is that the only way you can really have an objective test of people's leadership success is in general elections. By the number of seats have gone up and down, number of percentage of the vote that's gone, number of votes cast, whether that's gone up. That is an objective test. You may say it's not, but every other test is essentially subjective, as people say he or she did well. And party leadership is a different quality in this context from governmental leadership. It's related to it, but it's a different thing. Obviously, if you're a party leader in opposition, as Keir Starmer was, and Kemi Badenoch is, your fundamental test isn't to govern well in opposition, because you're not in government. There's a different set of criteria that come into play. So I produced my chapter, puts in order the leaders, and I'm just going to go through them for both parties, because some of the figures are quite surprising. If you rank by seats gained or lost, Labour leaders over the whole of the history of the Labour Party, and there's a slight difference in terms of share of the vote, but the figures are there. Most successful leader by seats gained or lost, Clement Attlee, which won't surprise many people. He had a massive landslide in 1945. Second most successful, Keir Starmer, which will surprise people even with the big majority that he had this time. Third was Clines, a post-war Labour, First World War Labour leader, also did very well. Then Tony Blair did well despite defeats in later elections, or losing seats, I should say, in later elections, 2005 in particular. Neil Kinnock came fifth. I worked for Neil for many years, and that is normally higher than most people would think of Neil Kinnock as, because he got about 20 seat increases in 2 successive general elections and went up. Harold Wilson, just under Neil Kinnock, he had some worse results, so didn't move forward. Keir Hardie, then Adamson and Henderson, First World War leaders who are not widely known, and Barnes similarly. Gateskill, very unsuccessful as a leader. Hugh Gateskill, often a hero ideologically to some parts of the Labour Party. In fact, electorally, very unsuccessful. Ed Miliband, very unsuccessful also. Jeremy Corbyn, extremely unsuccessful. He had a relatively good first election and then a relatively poor second election. Jim Callaghan, a very poor result. Often the people who get bad results are prime ministers who come in after a successful prime minister. And Jim Callaghan, it was after Harold Wilson, he was dealing with the end of that term. Michael Foot had a very bad result. Ramsay MacDonald had the disastrous result. And then worst of all, Gordon Brown. That was the list of performers. It's at least a discussion point. Why did these people perform well, some of other people? And that's what we in fact discuss in the book. On the Conservative side, similar table. Most successful, their leadership, of course, doesn't go back to the turn of the 18th to 19th to 20th century, but right back to 1832. Robert Peel, their most successful leader, then Lord Salisbury in the back end of the 19th century. Then, unbelievably, this still surprises me, David Cameron, very successful Tory leader, coming in third, just ahead of Margaret Thatcher. Again, that is a surprising result for me. Cameron had a two-phase success, first in 2010, defeating Gordon Brown by quite a good turn of votes, and then going up again in 2015. Then Stanley Baldwin, 1930s Prime Minister, then Bonar Law, then Boris Johnson, in his one election as leader, did relatively well. Michael Howard, surprisingly, did relatively then going further on down, Theresa May, disastrous. She had a terrible election, completely misjudging the situation. Then Ted Heath, then Benjamin Disraeli, who most of us looking back through time probably think he was a giant of the century, but again, not performing well in elections. Then Alec Douglas Hume, a rather strange Tory party leader, then Earl Derby, then Winston Churchill. Of course, Winston Churchill, a number of elections, but his heart was not, he did very badly indeed. Then Balfour, then John Major, a totally disastrous. But thinking hard about why it is that some people choose a successful political leader, you have to be thinking about that much more than often seems.
Brilliant, thank you, Charles. And just focusing, what we'll do is we'll zoom in on some of the contemporary leaders in a moment. But just thinking about the methods, and political scientists love to think about methods. I mean, Tim, as approaches, I mean, are these fair frameworks, or is there a problem in terms of evaluating leaders? Do you think in terms of statecraft and league tables of results?
No, I mean, I think there's a general suspicion of league tables because they bled into sort of social and political and educational life recently in ways that, you know, teacher, you're married to a teacher. Yes, exactly. You know, there is some suspicion about that, but I do think actually that Charles's approach in this case is useful, partly because, as he says, it explodes some of the myths around particular success, around partly for what to the path itself. So, for example, Benjamin is seen now as kind of quintessence of one nation Toryism, and there's a kind of halo effect whereby people you know, look at that and then extrapolate from that to think that he was actually a particularly successful leader electorally, you know, which was not the case. And I think, you know, that for, you know, that reason alone, actually, that approach works very well. I think taking the statecraft approach is useful too. I think very often, as political scientists, it can be quite fruitful to take an approach which is to some extent a kind of off-the-shelf approach, which has been used in other ways, and see if one can adapt it to a particular purpose. In this case, you know, judging leaders. So, you know, I would say as a social scientist, I'm all for that, really. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, Emmanuelle, feel free to come in. Or
well, one point I was going to make is that I think the books themselves and the work that Charles and Toby have done is hugely valuable in trying to systematize and to try to better understand what are the ingredients or the elements of effective political leadership. Actually, I think political scientists have rather missed a trick on that, partly because we tend to be more structural in our understanding of political life. Having said that, though, I think there's a question which is worth putting on the table, which is also, do we, in some contexts, risk overstating the importance of political leadership? So, or of particular leaders. So to think about the last time Labour was in power between 1997 and 2010, I think the analysis of that period of government, there was in some ways an over-concentration on what two particular figures, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, were doing, and not enough concentration on what's happening in the rest of the Labour Party. Similarly, I think today there's a risk that lots of issues that we attribute to leaders are actually the product of the external environment that they inhabit. And I think that's very clear in the case of Keir Starmer, who I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. But Keir Starmer as a leader has clearly strengths and weaknesses. But I think a lot of the criticism that is made of him is in a sense a reflection of the fact that he's governing in a very difficult environment, economically, socially, given the impact of issues like immigration, the foreign policy and external environment with Trump, and obviously the ongoing issues around Brexit. So political leadership is a very valuable subject of study, but it should not delude us from the point that leaders are operating in an environment which they don't control, and we have to put every leader in their context. And if we just treat leaders as individuals outside any context, and I think we run the risk of misunderstanding what they're trying to do, and in some cases probably criticise them too much. The final point will just be around the question of competence, because again, I think the statecraft framework obviously puts a very strong emphasis on the importance of leadership attaining competence in order to win election. In the time that I've been involved in studying politics, which is now going on for 30 years, I would say that there has been something of a shift in the sense that I think when I started my involvement in Labour politics, a lot of the emphasis was on the need for the Labour Party to establish governing competence. And of course, that remains the case now. I do think one of the shifts we've seen, particularly around voting behaviour, though, is that clearly competence is not the only thing that matters in framing voter choice. And I think identity, values have in some ways become much more important. And one of the problems that the contemporary Labour Party has is that clearly there is a significant element of its electorate that wants this Labour government to offer more than just competence. It wants there to be values, it wants there to be a sense of direction, it wants there to be a story, it wants there to be a political vision. And it's the absence of those things in some sense that's weakening Labour, irrespective of whether or not it manages to attain governing competence. Attaining competence is, of course, vital, but without values and being able to project a political vision, I think we can see the limitations of that approach, which are very much borne out in the situation facing the current Starmer government.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And before we go back to Keir Starmer, Emmanuelle, do you want to comment on frameworks?
I'm trying to interact, but I hope you can hear me. I'm not too loud. Is it okay? The sound? Good. I don't want. Okay. Well, I'm really following on from what Patrick just said. This was the point I was going to make, which is, of course, the statecraft framework is very useful. Winning elections, delivering, etc., is of course paramount. But I think that it would be useful to add some elements to the mix, and in particular, what was just said about having a vision and a strategy. Because as a government, as a prime minister, it's obviously important to have the ability to articulate a long-term plan that goes beyond the next electoral cycle, to have the ability to build coalition, to unify disparate groups in order to foster consensus and thereby goodwill. And finally, to have the ability to anticipate, which is something that is really lacking, the ability to make a decision now that will not create bigger problems in the future. And it seems to me that these elements are what most party leaders are lacking. And in order to get that, I mean, it's obviously quite difficult to find an answer to this lack of a strategic vision, but trying to have some kind of learning process, not only in order to learn from past errors and obviously avoid repeating them, but also trying to establish an ongoing learning process while exercising power in order to make big decisions now and not postpone. And I think the COVID case is an example of how not to do things. So that's all I wanted to add on this point.
And of course, I take those arguments very seriously. But I think if you look objectively in terms of shifting the Labour Party from a position where it had been subjected to a very significant defeat in 2019, a position whereby by 2024 it could win one of the largest parliamentary majorities in its history, I think it's quite mean to turn around and say Keir Starmer is an entirely ineffectual leader, because clearly many of the steps that he took in that period were in their own terms effective. But there were obviously huge omissions. And I think for me, the biggest, which I highlight in the chapter, was the utter lack of proper coherent preparation for being in government. I think many of the problems that you see that have bedeviled the Labour government over the last 18 months reflect the fact that in too many areas of policy, particularly in the economic strategy and fiscal and tax policy area, there was not sufficient thought given before the election to what kinds of plans Labour would need. I think that the decision to rule out increasing the basic or higher rate of income tax will go down as one of the most disastrous political decisions of the last 50 years. I think it was fiscally and economically incompetent and has imposed a huge straitjacket on the Labour government, which I think will have reverberations for years to come. Just to say one more thing, Toby, about Keir Starmer's current position. Clearly, since I wrote that chapter, as you've kindly pointed out, his position has weakened somewhat. But I think we shouldn't forget that this is not something which is that unusual for Labour governments. Actually, if you go back and look at any established history of the Attlee government, certainly if you look at the history of the Wilson government, and I think the same would apply to Callaghan too, as Labour leaders, they were constantly faced with leadership plots, instability, attempts to usurp them, factions trying to undermine their own position within the party. So you could say that as far as Keir Starmer's concerned, what he's experiencing is nothing particularly exceptional, but it's just the life of a Labour leader in office.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what, Patrick, I mean, what do you think the reasons for that kind of lack of planning? Was it something that was going on in terms of the Labour Party? Obviously, there'd been a period of change from Corbyn to Starmer and so on. Was that part of it?
I would like to defer to Charles on this question because he'll have a much more useful perspective than I could bring. I mean, the question that I would in a sense put back to Charles would be that in the period when Labour was last in opposition for an extensive period between 1979 and 1997, the party made enormous strides in modernising and updating its approach under Neil Kinnock, then obviously subsequently under Tony Blair, very briefly under John Smith. And I think it did make through the policy review and other processes, major progress in thinking through its ideas, its position in the world, what it really thought, what it would do on the economy, the welfare state, and so on. I think for various reasons, this time around, the 14 years of opposition have been largely wasted years as far as Labour was concerned. Now, you can say that that was partly to do with the nature of the leaderships of Jeremy Corbyn and to an extent Ed Miliband. I think in fairness to Ed Miliband, there was an attempt during his leadership to rethink Labour's economic position in the aftermath of the financial crisis. But unfortunately, the thinking, for whatever reason, was never translated into what I would describe as a kind of robust plan for government that was both going to deliver competence, but also give some sense of political vision and direction. But as I say, I mean, I think, Charles and Tim will have no doubt much more perceptive thoughts than I on the question of why Labour did not come into government with a sufficiently rigorous governing agenda.
Sure, thank you. So Charles, first then, I mean, do you agree with the assessment of Starmer? How is he doing?
Definitely. I think in terms of your chapter, the point that is really, really important about this, in addition to what Patrick said, very many people believe that Keir Starmer had no possibility of being in government at all, let alone with the majority like it was, when he became leader. That included me, by the way, and large numbers of other people. It was seen as an impossible task. But he was able to get that overall majority, albeit on a low proportion vote. My anecdote about your point, Patrick, is this. During the election campaign, I was speaking at the Hay Festival, and I came back to Hereford Station. And on Hereford Station, who should be there but Keir Starmer? with his election team. They were traveling that part of the world. And I saw him, we said hello, and we had a very nice conversation for about 15 minutes before the train went. And we had exactly this conversation. I said that what I personally was trying to do as a greybeard was to do what I could to help Labour get into a position where it operated in its first 6 months in the best possible way, deep constraints and so on. I remembered the period of the early Blair government, 1997, where a significant number of major mistakes were made at that time. And it was a question of how to try and avoid them. He completely agreed and said it was very important to get people of my generation in to try and think how that was. And he then said, the person he then employed, Sue Gray, would contact me to have a long conversation. The fields I was particularly interested in were home affairs, including immigration and education. But despite efforts throughout the campaign, no contact actually came. And I don't think that was because Keir didn't mean it. I think it's because he didn't have a functioning operation at that time. Sue Gray subsequently left. But throughout the whole process now, does he have a functioning operation to carry it through? And he didn't have a functioning operation prior to July 2024. And you rightly contrast that with the efforts that Tony Blair made prior to 97 to prepare in different areas. One area where he did have an operation that worked was Jonathan Powell, who was the person who was Tony's chief executive in government, who Keir did bring in as the Foreign Affairs National Security Advisor, which is what he's doing this very day, almost orchestrating the negotiations between Ukraine and Europe and so on the war to try and end it. And the area where Keir's strongest at the moment is his perception in foreign policy, where he's by and large perceived to have done a good job. But he has nobody, and I do mean nobody, in contrast on the domestic front, and in particular on the economic front, which is a key area. And when we're talking about governing competence for Labour, that was always economic. It's only in its whole history, Labour has only been seen as economically competent between about 1996 and 2008, the 2008 financial crash. In the whole of its rest of its history, Labour was seen as disastrous in economic fields. So I think you're completely correct. The work was not done. It was difficult to do. Only some of the shadow cabinet members as there then were did the job to think through what they should do in cabinet. I'd name one or two of them as having done that work, but it wasn't being done generally. And then Rishi Sunak caught Labour short by calling the election about 2 or 3 months earlier than was anticipated, when I think they'd been intending to do some work in that field. And then they were suddenly into it, all the international stuff, the stuff from Southport and so on. And the people felt, and it's very rare that you have a change of government of this scale. It's only about 6 times since 1945 that you've got the historic change. People think governments alternate the whole time. They don't actually. And so the new lot came in, the Labour lot that's now there, without having thought through sufficiently what needed to be done. Now, the question is, can they recover? And I think in some of the areas they are actually recovering and doing better than they did in the first 6 months after coming into office. But the massive question underlies all of it is the economy. And the budget tomorrow will be exceptionally important because it's perceived that they have not done well in that field. And I myself agree with that. And the question is, can that be put back on track?
Great. Thank you, Charles. Emmanuelle, did you want to come in on having studied previous Labour leaders?
Yes, thank you very much. So yes, obviously it's the trajectory of the Labour Party under Keir Starmer has been quite staggering, and then perhaps the most it's quite surprising considering the time that they had to prepare while in opposition, and then considering the size of the majority, how much the Labour government in power seems to have been, and here I'm echoing things that have just been said, mainly reactive rather than proactive, reactive to events, reactive to polls, to what other parties are saying, especially Farage, as we're going to discuss later. And it's just a little bit surprising to see how unwilling Keir Starmer and other members of the government are to make a case for certain things that should be a no-brainer. I think on Brexit, on immigration, even on defending the BBC, there's a case to be made. I'm not entirely sure why why the decision has been made not to take a stand or even to stand up against some, of the most vitriolic critics of the government. Is it unwillingness, not being able to? Is it something to do with Keir Starmer himself, or has it got to do with the team of people around him advising him? I'm not sure. So it seems to me that there has been great success in turning the party around and establishing a quasi-hegemonic supremacy on the party, but that has a sting in the tail, in the sense that it's also a source of weakness, because the lack of pluralism means that there is a some people have talked about a culture of fear in the party, in the sense that there's a lot of people in this sort of soft middle of the Labour Party that is the largest part, both in the Parliamentary Labour Party and in the party at large, that is become reluctant to speak up and is becoming restless. So I think that some degree of pluralism would be probably one way of ensuring that some a better party culture can be re-established, and that would be probably beneficial to the practice of government.
We are studying leaders. If you're studying leaders, knowing something about the kind of penumbra around the leader is incredibly important.
Just to add to it, Toby, I think it would be an interesting sixth point for the statecraft points would be the leadership team, possibly including some members of the cabinet or shadow cabinet, the personal officers. But never forget, it is the leader who appoints that team, and it's not given from outside. All the people we've talked about are appointed by the leader themselves.
Writing it down, it's ready for the third edition, Charles. So, Tim, looking then at Conservative leaders, so obviously usually at a Prime Minister power and they're unpopular, we tend to be that votes share or voting intentions at least would usually go to the main opposition party, but obviously the Conservative Party hasn't panned out that way since the general election for Kemi Badenoch. So how is she faring? Is this her fault, or as Patrick was saying earlier on, there's so many shifts going on that maybe this isn't entirely?
I mean, I think I should preface what I would say about Kemi Badenoch by reminding everybody that parties that suffer very, very big electoral defeats very rarely come back in return. And it is an incredibly difficult job to take over when you've suffered a landslide defeat, or even when you've suffered, a defeat that wasn't quite as bad as you thought it was. So, Ed Miliband's job wasn't easy. Neil Kinnock's job certainly wasn't easy, taking over after 1983. And to some extent, I think, you have to bear that in mind when you're judging Kemi Badenoch. I thought I would do it by introducing, and I hope you don't mind me doing this, another framework, because other frameworks are available, as they say. And there's a particularly apposite one when we're studying Conservative leaders, which is by a historian called Stuart Ball, who has written extensively about how the Conservative Party recovers from bad defeats. And he has a kind of task-orientated list. And I thought I'd then take you through that list and talk about Kemi Badenoch accordingly. So the first thing on the list is what he calls fresh faces. So that's the duty of the leader, to provide a kind of leadership team that will, give the impression that, this is a party on the up that has changed. And I think in that respect, you can say that she's failed. Most of the people around Kemi Badenoch in the shadow cabinet are kind of all too familiar. They were either ministers or, in the lower ranks of the kind of ministerial team during Rishi Sunak's premiership. But you can't really blame her for that, because the defeat they suffered in 2024 was so bad that the talent pool is, shall we say, exceptionally shallow. So maybe we should give her a kind of pass on that one. The second one that Stuart comes up with is cohesion, by which he means unity and discipline within the party, establishing unity and discipline. You'd have to say, on a superficial level, probably yes. Okay, you've not got the Conservative Party at the moment, anyway, completely factionalised and tearing itself apart. But it is only superficial, because clearly, as anyone who follows politics will know, there's an awful lot of briefing going on against Kemi Badenoch from within her own ranks. Generally, there's a kind of whispering campaign against her, saying that she's not up to it, that she's not going to be the person who leads the party into the next general election. And it's fairly obvious that one or two people, in particular, obviously, Robert Jenrick, are quote unquote on manoeuvres and hoping to take over as soon as possible. So I don't think we can give her a passing grade on cohesion. The next dimension is what he calls visibility, which is creating a kind of new agenda for the party in terms of policy and even shading into ideology, which actually establishes some kind of distance from what the party was before they took over. And you could say, well, yes, okay, she's talked about withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights. That's one big signature policy that establishes a change from what went on in Rishi Sunak, who was kind of thinking about this, but never really got round to doing it. On the other hand, I don't think that really is something that qualifies, because it's merely doubling down in some senses on the direction that the party was taking under previous leaders. And if you look at some of the early commitments that she's made, so for example, reversing Labour's plan to change things on inheritance tax for the farming community, for example, or putting VAT on private school fees, that's really just the Conservative Party, in its comfort zone, really, defending fairly familiar vested interests. So I think on visibility as in cohesion, you can't give her a passing grade. Next up is something Stuart calls efficiency, which is about really improving and reviving the party organisation. And here there has been some success in the sense that, as she herself has talked about quite recently, she has managed to kind of turn around the financial situation of the Conservative Party. It is fascinating to me that given the poor polling of the Conservative Party, people are still willing to give it hundreds of thousands of pounds. And hope, perhaps beyond hope, that things can turn around for the party. So there is one dimension of that efficiency where I think she does have a passing grade, but on the other hand, that money doesn't seem to have filtered through, partly because they don't want to spend it. They need to build up a kind of chest, as it were, to making CCHQ any better. It's still quite an underpowered organisation, under-resourced organisation. That's Conservative campaign headquarters. And if you look at membership, which is obviously another extremely important part of the Conservative Party's organisation, I would be extremely surprised if the Conservative Party now had 100,000 members. I think it's probably now down into the tens of thousands. David Cameron will be proud. That's about the only thing he's managed to get down from the hundreds of thousands to the tens of thousands. So again, I wouldn't give her a passing grade on efficiency, similar to what I said on cohesion and visibility. And then the last thing Stuart talks about is what he calls adaptability. So that is a kind of pragmatic, even unideological kind of direction, which gives you freedom for room for manoeuvre. I think clearly, Kemi Badenoch fails on this. She is a deeply ideological politician. She is a bog standard Thatcherite, low spending, low taxation, and she is a culture warrior to boot. She is not the most flexible politician by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that's why the Conservative Party is still stuck in the groove, even though it's begun to talk more about economic matters as a way of differentiating itself from reform. The way it talks about them is still very kind of old hat and very familiar to those of us who've been familiar with the Conservative Party for years. There's still no kind of coming to terms with what the Conservative Party did between 2010 and 2024 to public services. It's very noticeable, for example, in the leadership contest, not a single person mentioned the NHS and the need to do something about the crumbling state of the NHS. It's still, very much about reducing taxation and reducing spending, even though all the evidence is that actually the NHS was extremely important to people and did help do for the Conservative Party in 2024. So I think, her fundamental problem, it seems to me, and it's one she shares with most of her colleagues, is a misdiagnosis of what went wrong in 2024 for the party, just as they misdiagnosed what went right for the party in 2019. In 2019, the diagnosis from the Conservative Party, the explanation of their success in 2019 was that there was this sort of the realignment, as they called it, in British politics, of which they were the architects and the winners, when in fact the 2024 election was the BBC election. It was Brexit, it was Boris, and it was Corbyn. It was much more contingent than perhaps they imagined. In 2024, Kemi Badenoch's analysis, and it's one, as I say, she shares with many of her colleagues, is that the Conservative Party in government talked right but governed left, giving you the impression that it was somehow some sort of social democratic formation, which is not something I think any objective observer would agree with. And I think the clinging to that belief, the clinging to that misdiagnosis, has led the Conservative Party to chase reform and be obsessed with chasing reform, rather than think about some of the votes that it lost in the other direction, in particular to the Liberal Democrats. And then finishing up, I think on a personal level, it wouldn't just be me to say this, but there is a kind of arrogance about Kemi Badenoch, which many people find off-putting, a kind of prickliness, which makes her relationships with journalists difficult. At PMQ, she's proved herself often quite flat-footed, sometimes sort of fluffing her lines, although she has improved recently, and there does seem to be a kind of media consensus developing that she's getting better in that state. But talking about metrics, that is not a great metric to judge an opposition leader. If you think about William Hague, he very often managed to best Tony Blair, and yet, still lost the election in 2001 by almost as much as the Conservative Party lost it in 1997. And anyway, she's up against Keir Starmer, and that is not a particularly high bar. So in conclusion, I'd say if I had to give her a letter grade, I'd give her a D. And I'm not sure that she'll be returning for the autumn term next year.
Brilliant, thank you, Tim. So to turn then to Emmanuelle, and obviously we talk about different concepts, different ways to measure political leaders. What grade formation we give them is coming in here. But if we were just to be looking at the polls, the opinion polls, then we've only considered the Labour and Conservative leaders in these books. But just looking at the polls, Nigel Farage has taken the Reform Party to what looks like, who knows how it will happen, a major fundamental shift in British electoral history. So, to what extent is this something to which we should sort of credit Nigel Farage as the leader, or is this, as we're hearing here, the failure of other party leaders getting a D or something else on Tim's grade assessments, or are there some other sort of fundamental shifts here that which Nigel Farage is kind of riding on?
Okay, so moving. So first I wanted to say that I agreed with what Tim was saying, but also saying that in terms of leadership, there's a learning curve, and Kemi Badenoch herself admitted that she had a lot to learn, and she felt she was improving. And the question is also who and what are they learning? Are people learning to become to behave as leaders? So on Farage, I'm not an authority on Farage on reform, so I might be stating the obvious. There's, I suppose, three main factors. So there's obviously the general context, but I think we this is the basis that we're all working from, the populist push worldwide, etc. But in terms of Farage and reform in the UK, obviously a lot of this is down to personality and style, which is not something that people like to emphasize too much, but in his case, it plays a great role, obviously. He has a personal brand that is quite strong in coming across or presenting himself as a maverick, as Johnson did, not serious, an amateur, also presenting himself as an outsider and anti-establishment figure, which is paradoxical, obviously, since he's a prime specimen of that establishment, which he claims to be standing against. And also, something which I think resonates quite a lot with the growing voter cynicism is the idea that he's authentic, that he says what he thinks, that he has no filter, which he can claim contrast, or probably does contrast with the sort of more constrained ways in which other leaders are presenting their ideas. And flowing from this is obviously the fact that these personality traits and this branding strategy means that he's the focus of media attention as a political figure, the right-wing press, obviously, legacy media in general. Obviously, we remember Ed Davey complaining that he doesn't get a look in, despite the Lib Dems having a much larger number of MPs. It was not on the program, but we could be talking about Zach Polanski as well as another case study, but probably not today. Farage also has his, as it were, own channel with GB News, which generates a lot of the stories which will appear elsewhere. So he has this media environment in which he thrives. And we could add here the fact that he's supported by people abroad and Trump in particular. And thirdly, he has this ability to articulate a very simplistic message on Brexit, now on immigration, and somehow manages to force the other parties, Labour and the Conservatives, to adopt his core policy positions. We've just seen that with the Conservatives. They could decide to do something else, to take a stance, to distance themselves, to put clear blue water between themselves and Farage, but they're choosing not to. They're playing catch up, and so I think in all this, he manages to dominate the political conversation. I think another point you were asking is whether, sorry, the sound is coming in and out for me, so I'm maybe missing some of the things that people are saying, or even some parts of your question. But I think you were asking also whether this would last. So there's one element which would seem to point out to the fact that, like Trump, he might be immune. Trump was immune to all the scandals that were attached to him and managed to be elected. So Farage may escape scrutiny on his link with Russia, cue Nathan Gill, and raised the racist comments that he may or may not have made when he was at school. Having said that, there are some obvious weaknesses in him as a leader and in this project. One main weakness is that the party brand is it cannot be dissociated from him as a person, so that if he falls, if for some reason it was demonstrated that he was a traitor, for example, for having dealings with Russia, that could really endanger the whole project. And I don't think reform could outlast Farage. Another weakness and a major Achilles heel, and that's why I'm a bit surprised that the other parties are not playing that card more, is foreign policy. So Starmer is doing it a bit, but he could do it a lot more. And the Conservatives do not seem to be playing that card, but theirs is his real weakness, I think, and that's something that other parties could play on. And so perhaps in this sense, can he be really regarded as a party leader as such? It seems that this, we were talking earlier about when we talk about leaders, should we not also be talking about leadership and the whole team around the leader, not just the leader in particular? And in his case, it seems that his foundations are very weak, since he doesn't really have that much of an organization that is strong around him, and we've seen the string of incompetent councillors. So this sort of raises the issue of whether he really cuts a credible prime ministerial figure, and whether the current polls are more the manifestation of a protest vote and a desire to have mainstream parties tackling problems in a different way. But again, these are just my thoughts on a topic that I'm not that knowledgeable about.
I think some of the doubts about his personality, his ability to kind of command a team, his grip on policy, apart from but I'm not sure he gets into the weeds on that, probably begin to tell on him as we approach the general election. Yeah. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that people will kind of wake up to the problems that reform presents, but I do think, as Emmanuelle said, there are some weaknesses about Nigel Farage that probably will have some bearing on the way people vote. In addition to the fact, and this has come out recently from some research that's done by a think tank, a polling think tank that's reported in Politics Home over the weekend. People are concerned about the lack of experience, not just from Nigel Farage in terms of running the country, but in terms of a party which currently has 5 MPs would need to have 325 MPs in order to form a majority. So another 320 people who've never been in Parliament before, I think would be quite a difficult thing for some people to swallow. Having said that, of course, if there is some kind of pact between Reform and the Conservatives prior to an election, he might be able to get round that particular problem. Because he would be able to suggest that there will be Conservative politicians who have been in government who will be part of his government, and that might reassure, wouldn't necessarily reassure me, but it might reassure some people on that score.
The key point which Toby, which Emmanuelle made, was the element of the reform vote, which is a protest vote against the whole system, yeah. And that was true in Brexit as well. And however well Nigel Farage himself performs, there is this enormous chunk of the electorate which feels deeply dissatisfied with the political system in this country in various different ways. Mm. And that won't go away. So I do think that's a factor which will influence the next election outcome, whatever happens.
Just to add, though, one other point, I think that we could certainly, those of us who might not look fondly on the idea of a Farage-led government, depress ourselves into thinking that this is perhaps an inevitability coming down the track. I think, notwithstanding Charles's point about not taking too much notice of current opinion polls, when you look at actual elections, the by-election that took place in Caerphilly in Wales a couple of months ago was very instructive. Labour performed disastrously in that by-election, but the Plaid vote rose considerably, and there was a sense that the anti-Farage electorate chose the candidate best placed to beat Reform in that by-election. And I think that raises an important question, which is, will the dynamic at the next general election be one in which voters are encouraged in key constituencies to mobilise against and support the candidate best placed to defeat Reform and Farage? I think if that is the case in the first past the post system, it will be difficult for Farage to break through and actually become a governing party with Reform. The other quick question I would just put on the table, Toby, is about the economy, because again, I think the conventional wisdom would be that if the UK economy is considerably improving by the time of the next general election, if wages are rising, if employment is going up, if people have more opportunities, if regional economic disparities are shrinking, then Labour would be well positioned to win the election. But I think, again, it comes back to this question of, is economic competence sufficient to win, or do you need something else? And also, I think, as we saw with the Biden administration in the United States at the last presidential election, the Biden administration's economic performance on the conventional statistics was quite strong. The problem was that many ordinary American working people did not feel that that growth and improved productivity was feeding through into their own personal economic circumstances. So the trick for this Labour government is going to be not just to get the economy right, but to make sure that voters feel that in their own experience, their living standards, their livelihoods, their own economic position is improving. I think if that's the case, then we could be, those of us who wouldn't want to see a reform government could be reasonably optimistic that Nigel Farage could be defeated.
Great, thank you very much. At that moment, I'll pause and we'll open it up for questions from the audience or brief comments. Just if you want to make a point, then that's fine. Just try and keep each comment brief. I'll do them in rounds of 3. So we've got a mic working its way around, so I'll wait for that just to reach you.
Sorry, let me just get my notes up. I think it's always interesting when people suggest that they think Starmer is like this great political leader because of how he won a massive majority. At the end of the day, Starmer was Labour leader during numerous scandals, Partygate, Chris Pincher, the mini budget, and it got to the point where he didn't even face the preferred option for the Conservative Party in their replacement of Johnson. He faced their sort of reject that came around after a half-hearted Johnson attempt at a return. And still, he did worse than what the polls said. He achieved less votes than Corbyn did. He got less seats than MRP polls were saying, and he did worse in percentage points as well. And as a Labour campaigner in that time, in a heavily Tory seat that did flip towards Labour, I can say firsthand there was no passion for the Labour Party, but instead a deep hatred for the Tories. In fact, there were a lot of Green voters. It was very Sneddon and Stowmarket, so Mid-Suffolk District Council is a big part of that. So there was a lot of Green voters who lent their votes to us to see the Tories leave. So I'm just wondering if the panel can sort of justify their position on saying that Starmer was a really effective leader in the run-up and during the election.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We'll take a couple more comments and questions, and then we'll give the panel a chance to respond. So one over here, then, please. And then Professor Finlayson.
Hello. I must confess I'm a bit biased in this question because I'm a computer science student, but I was watching a video recently comparing US political leaders to Chinese ones, and one of the things they noted was that Chinese leaders tended to be STEM graduates. So Xi Jinping, for example, has a degree in chemical engineering. I wonder, so I had a look at UK. In the 2019 Tory cabinet, there was 1 STEM graduate. Since the creation of the post of actually Secretary of State for Science, Technology and Science, Innovation and Technology, none of the 4 holders have had a BSc. They've all had arts degrees. Now, I wonder whether this contributes to a lack of knowledge, and I also wonder whether there are sort of approach differences between an engineering degree and between, say, a social science and a arts degree, where maybe, for example, in politics, you focus more about how to win elections, whereas if I, as a computer scientist, were to say, well, I got my system implemented, it didn't work at all, but it got, it was a complete disaster when it came in, but it got implemented, nobody would call that a success. So sort of similar to the previous point, people are saying Keir Starmer's effective because he got in, but as an engineer, I'd only call it a success if you actually had a real world change.
Thank you, everybody, for your interesting comments and your great questions. It would help if our politicians could read data better. It's just a question about how the demands of leadership are changing, because we sort of talked about it as if it's kind of an invariant sort of quality. And it seems to me that it's not, and that it's under profound stress. What a leader is changing. And that's in part because leadership is not an inherent quality of an individual. No one's a leader on their own. It's something that we let others do. It's a relationship between the leader and the people who are led. And they partly win it and we partly let them do it. And the most successful leaders, it seems to me, are partly successful because they don't lead that much, as it were, in terms of doing things. They let others do it. They enable other people, they empower other people, they inspire them, they give them a vocabulary. And I wonder if one of the things that has changed is that the number of people a leader to be successful has to inspire and motivate has increased. It's not just their leadership team and their cabinet and their ministers. It's also people who run all kinds of other agencies, universities and businesses and so forth. But we live now in a very participatory culture. It's also people on the ground who want to be inspired and motivated and feel empowered. And part of what Farage and Polanski are able to do is make their potential followers feel empowered, feel they have agency and can act, whether that's raising a flag or protesting something. It seems to me that the leaders who we've been talking about in Westminster do not leave their followers feeling empowered, they leave them feeling rather powerless and depressed. So the question really is, has leadership changed? What is needed of it? And is it in part to do with the way in which our culture has become, has an expectation of participation and empowerment within it? And we need leaders who are not just promising delivery and competence, so that's important, but are also promising to support and enable others to implement the changes that will make the country better.
Actually, did kind of understand some of the stuff that she was being presented with compared to Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock, who clearly didn't. So I think that's a good point. I'll let the others answer the question about Keir Starmer, because I think that's a really good question. Just on Alan's, I mean, I think that's interesting. I haven't thought about it in that way. I mean, I tend to think, the more difficult problem for leaders now is the rise of a more kind of consumerist attitude among voters. We are so used now to, in the market, getting what we want, when we want it, and that's normally tomorrow if you're on Amazon Prime, that I think people have, to some extent, a rather less patient attitude to governments than they used to. I'm not saying that people used to put up with anything. It's also obviously got to do with the decline of kind of party loyalty and the fact that fewer and fewer people are actually consider themselves as partisans of particular parties. But on the point about inspiring, I mean, I think one of the fascinating things about Farage is that he's able to inspire 260,000 people to join a political party when they have absolutely zero say in choosing the leader and absolutely zero say in any policy. And yet, such is his charisma and such is his sort of ability to tap into this zeitgeist that he's managed to do that. At least when you're looking at Polanski, you can see why a lot of Green members voted for him, because, they have a very flat sort of basis democracy organisation and they'll have a say in the way he takes the party.
Charles.
You're quite right. The election in July 2024 was about getting the Tories out. That was utterly the dominant sensation everywhere. Everybody knew that, including Keir Starmer and his team. What, therefore, was the leadership strategy which required some skill by Keir Starmer and his team? It was to make people not frightened of Labour or of a Labour government. It wasn't to inspire them with doing X or Y or Z. It was to make them not frightened. That led to an incredibly risk-averse strategy, which led to one of the mistakes that Patrick described earlier about the tax pledges in the manifesto, for example, simply to avoid any risk of any kind. I was elected in 1997 in this constituency here, and I didn't believe until 5 a.m. that we would get a Labour majority in Parliament. I was too pessimistic, but the fact was people didn't believe it. In the case of Keir Starmer and his team, they absolutely did not believe that they would win the July 24 general election until the votes were all in the ballot box. And so they averted risk. Now, it's difficult if you're leading an opposition party to avert all risks, because all kinds of people say all kinds of things. You should be doing this, you should be doing that. But it was a skill of political strategy by Keir Starmer and his team to ensure that this was an election where people could let their hatred of the Conservatives out without being inhibited by the fact that Labour might do something terrible or awful. Now, you may say it's not a very exciting political talent or whatever, but actually I think it was a decisive one in giving us the outcome that we did actually get. On Alan's point, the only thing I'd add to what Tim has said is I of course agree, leadership is about listening. Leadership is about responding to remember in the Kinnock period, we had Labour listens and all kinds of ideas that were about trying to promote that. What is underestimated in this is the absolutely accelerating dominance of the 24/7 media in every single respect. So the articulacy, which Emmanuelle referred to in an earlier contribution quite correctly, which I think is a key aspect of political leadership, is important. But in the 24/7 media, it's often the articulacy of the very short soundbite rather than of something different. And that creates a different state of affairs, which makes it much more difficult to give the listening, which is an important component of leadership, the priority which it needs. I, of course, agree about having more mathematically literate, more scientifically literate people in government. I think it's absolutely very important, maths in particular, which was a subject I studied. I did say very important, you didn't mention the chemist Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, true, yes.
As a scientist in that role. But I don't fundamentally believe there's a correlation between the subject you studied and your effectiveness as a political leader.
Patrick, you.
Well, just to quickly follow up on the very good question about Keir Starmer, and I think you're absolutely right to, I think, bring out the sense of unease about Starmer's leadership that existed throughout much of this period. I think if one looks at the objective facts of what was happening in the period that Starmer was leader, his first year as leader was pretty close to disastrous. He, of course, was defeated in the summer of 2021 in the Hartlepool by-election, a traditional Labour constituency, which Labour in opposition would have been widely expected to win. Labour lost that by-election. And in fact, that led to some change in Starmer's operation. I mean, as Tim was saying earlier, it led Starmer to appoint a number of advisors, including, for example, Deborah Mattinson, who really focused on doing his polling in the so-called Red Wall constituencies. Not a concept I'm particularly supportive of, actually, but we can discuss that perhaps later on. Nonetheless, that gave his leadership a focus. And then when you look at the subsequent by-election results that Labour was achieving in 2023, 2024, it was getting some very impressive wins. I think, you know, as Charles rightly said, in part because Labour was making itself safe for voters that might otherwise have leaned towards the Conservatives. But I think, picking up on your question, it is undoubtedly the case that throughout this period, there was a great deal of unease in the Labour ecosystem, by which I mean among MPs, among commentators, among former politicians, among people working in think tanks, about what direction was the Starmer government taking. And so I think in the Starmer party taking before it came into government. So I think when we talk about Starmer being an effective leader, as I discussed at the beginning, if you look at the data and the facts of what was happening on the ground electorally, I think it's hard to argue that he was anything other than a success. But I completely accept that there were fundamental elements of his leadership that were lacking. And I think that has contributed to the weaknesses that Labour has encountered in government. I wanted to just make one other reflection on Alan's question, which is to say that I think one of the problems of political leadership in the British context, it would be interesting to get reflections from France on this as well, is that, of course, our political leadership tends to operate within a highly centralised political system. And I think one of the problems we have, particularly around our public policy approach, is a lack of distributed leadership and a lack of decentralisation of power. And I think why that relates to political leadership is because some political leaders are ineffective because they try and do too many things themselves from the centre. Too much meddling, too many micro initiatives, too much spin, too much attempts to run superficial initiatives that never go anywhere. And so I think, you know, building on your very interesting question, we have to think also about distributed leadership and trying to get away from the stranglehold of a very centralised approach, which I think has been damaging in many areas of our national life. And then very quickly, I think the question about disciplines and about who's coming into leadership is, again, a very important one. One concept we haven't talked about much this afternoon is groupthink. And again, I think one of the ways in which leadership sometimes goes wrong is because leadership cabals get infected by groupthink. We saw this during the COVID pandemic, as Tim was alluding to. But we've seen it in lots of other situations as well. And I think one of the rationales for making sure we bring people in from different disciplinary backgrounds is precisely to get away from the dangers of groupthink leadership.
Thank you. I'm going to do one final round of questions in a second. Very briefly, Emmanuelle, did you want to come in on that? I can see you waving. That's a yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed. Sorry, I hear myself talking back to myself. Is that okay? Sorry, I missed some of the comments. Sometimes the sound disappears. Just very quickly on the first question, I completely agree that it's difficult not to see the Starmer leadership as a success when it comes to winning the election. The campaigning strategy was superlative in delivering that massive majority. But then the question is, what do you do with it, with this massive victory? What do you do with it? And so the risk-averse strategy that secured the victory, does it need to continue once in power? So that's something that I was saying at the beginning. The second one, I missed most of Tim's answer, but I sort of caught, maybe mentioned Angela Merkel and how there's a possibility that the sort of scientific background might make people a bit more focused on trial and error and experimenting and perhaps listening or, to a wider range of views before making a decision. That's a point that's a point that has been made about the way that she handled the COVID crisis. And on the final one, clearly, yes, the expectations of the voters and citizens in general have changed, and there's this, as was said, a participatory, deliberative culture that has developed, which is quite at odds with the way that the Westminster political culture is continuing to function. With the system that's probably run its course, and one possibility that has been put forward to sort of reconnect citizens with political elites is to consider electoral reform. So I'm not advocating for a particular type of reform, but certainly engineering a national debate on electoral reform, I think, would go a long way to getting voters to feel that they are listened to and have a say in the way that the country is run, and addressing this lack of engagement generally that seems to be present. And I think it would help also address the issue of groupthink that has been mentioned.
Very briefly then, any final questions?
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. Picking up on Emmanuelle's point, really. We've all heard things like, "What's the point in voting?" And whether, if you like, in which the whole kind of electoral democratic self operates, with basically office being a reward for successful campaigning, I think above all, rather than necessarily successful governments, is leading to the very cynicism which is undermining the system as a whole.
Two quick questions, and then.
Hey, I want to make a quick comment on the likelihood of the Farage administration, being that, as you rightly highlighted, the election is now 4 years away. And as you also, several of you highlighted, in 2020, the idea that Keir Starmer would come with such a massive majority was fanciful. So we've got tons of time. But I want to ask a quick question about, and this was touched upon briefly already, but about party leadership and how it interacts with the party membership, and this being based on the different varieties of democratic structure within parties, specifically in relation to policy. For example, as you mentioned, with reforms, total lack of democratic structure, and the Greens' total democratic structure. I'm interested in how this affects the party leadership, not necessarily from the membership point of view, but from the leader's point of view. And then also in the case of Polanski, how this will affect him going forward, being more politically significant, and whether or not he is really leading the party or if he's kind of a puppet of the membership.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, hi. So you previously mentioned that the Conservatives are obviously on the decline. Kemi's probably going to get kicked out. You know, Stack Data Strategy recently predicted we're going to drop to 14 seats, so not a great future. And obviously you also mentioned that the Conservatives were perhaps making a mistake by not appealing to the centre. So I'd be curious to obviously hear your insights as to what that future leadership direction could be. Obviously the assumption is it's going to be generic, but is there an alternative centre-orientated leadership strategy for the Conservatives to return to power within 15 years, say?
Brilliant, thank you so much. So if we go just around the panelists now, feel free to answer which of those questions you want to, and add any kind of final comments that you'd like to conclude with. Charles.
I'm not very sympathetic to the cynic's view of politics. I think there's massive changes that happen in real life as a result of different political leaders taking place. The reason why I think it's so serious now is because of the essentially freezing in living standards since 2008, i.e. over a period of 16, 17 years. And so people feel that that sense of optimism which existed before then isn't there for now. But I essentially would argue against the cynical view. I think the answer on the second question is you have to get a relationship between the leader and their party and everybody else and take that forward in lots of ways. And that's about having substantive policy debate.
Okay, I'll answer the question about the Conservatives. The brief answer is no. I think you know, Boris Johnson's ejection of those 21 people, some of whom came back, I think was kind of historic and has kind of torn the heart out of any kind of attempt by the Conservative Party to move back to a more kind of pragmatic centrist alternative. I mean, the only person sort of touted in that regard is James Cleverly, but actually he pretty much shares quite a lot of the attitudes that I was talking about with regard to Kemi Badenoch. He's just a more affable kind of character, I think. And in terms of the question about membership, I mean, I think Polanski is really interesting in the sense that he's buoyed up by, you know, a belief that he's representing the members, and he is, because he won a massive majority in that leadership contest. However, he's a very different kind of leader for the Greens. He's very much kind of out there and you know, very, very kind of personality driven, central to their future direction. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. I think there is a tension there, possibly.
Patrick.
Yeah, well, Tim has to go and catch a train, so I'm very tempted to say absolutely nothing at this point. I miss it, and he's a good colleague of mine. But just in 10 seconds, I would say I'm going to make sure you come close to missing it.
Yeah, thanks.
But no, just I think they're very good questions, and they merit a proper answer. But I think on the question about can the Tories pivot to the centre, we've got the budget coming up tomorrow. I think it'll be very interesting to see whether measures that Labour puts in the budget lead to a return to a more traditional economic argument between left and right in the Conservatives and Labour. Now, it may well be, as Tim says, that the Conservatives are not capable of shifting into that space because they're too obsessed with immigration and identity. But I think if they were capable, then I wouldn't doubt that there would be some traction, because I think there will be some voters who will be nervous about what Labour is doing in raising taxes and increasing public spending, some of the changes on welfare and so on. So I think it'll be very interesting to watch that. And then on the party membership question, which is, again, a really important, interesting one, I think that one of the problems that Labour has had is that obviously they wanted to reject the Corbyn legacy, which was of having a model of a party which was participative, in which members would have more of a say. And then in the Starmer era, they've replaced a participative party with no party, really. The party has been completely marginalised and plays very little role in policy development. And I don't think that's a tenable long-term strategy in any sort of contemporary political system. So Labour is going to have to think, partly in the light of the challenge of the Greens, how does it recreate a party structure in which members do have more of a voice? Because I think without that, as was discussed, as the Kinnock era displayed, there's got to be a partnership between the party and the leadership. Otherwise, things will go wrong. So I think that's a major omission. Anyway, I hope you don't miss your train.
That's fine. Final 30 seconds, then Emmanuelle, final word so that Tim doesn't.
Well, I'll be very, very quick on membership. I think you can see membership as a ballast to leaders rather than as a counterpower. And I think in this, in those times of instability, changing leaders every 2 minutes is not necessarily the response that you need to give to the restlessness of voters. On the contrary, and the large memberships of the Labour Party and the Green Party are things that actually would protect a leader from these, the temptation to get rid of them every 5 minutes. I have to stop here. Sorry, I know that Tim needs to go.